I've talked a few times before about inward migration to Ireland and its significance politically and culturally, but I haven't talked much about the movement of people the other way, emigration. In recent history, Ireland's migration story has been much more about people leaving the country than coming to it. So, unsurprisingly, the fact that a lot of Irish people are living abroad plays a big part in the political conversation of the country. For example, during the recent elections, I saw the following infographic reposted a few times on social media: the countries with the most people living overseas, which lists the countries with the highest percentage of native-born people living abroad, as of the year 2014. It's an interesting presentation of data, but it's a bit light on explanation. And since I've seen it thrown into discussions, as though it should shut down any questions people have about migration, I feel it deserves a bit of examination. Citing the OECD as its source, Ireland is put top of the list, with 17.5% of its native-born population living abroad, in an article apparently written with the help of Statista, who made the original graphic. The 2008 financial crash is cited as one of the major reasons for this. But as anyone with even a passing familiarity with modern Irish history knows, emigration has been happening much longer than that. However, it's important to bear in mind that with the exception of Mexico, all of the countries listed with more than 10% of their native-born people living abroad have comparatively small populations. Most obviously, Iceland appears high on this list, with 11.7% of its population cited as living abroad. But as the population of Iceland is only about the same size as the population of Belfast, in real numbers this is only a very small amount of people. Statistics from the Icelandic government put the number of native-born Icelandic people living abroad at about 46,000, about the size of the population of Drogheda or Dundalk. Most of these Icelandic people are living in other Scandinavian countries. At the other end of the spectrum, China, who the infographic cites as having 0.3% of its native-born population living abroad, has an estimated population of 1.43 billion people as of 2019. 0.3% of this number would be 4.3 million people, just short of being equivalent to the entire population of the Republic of Ireland. This is a bit of a rough and ready way of parsing this data, but for the purposes of illustrating differences of scale, it'll suffice. It's worth also asking a few questions about the figures the original graphic is based on. For example, in 2019, a US Census report cited the UN for a figure of 10 million first-generation Chinese living outside of China, and by using a much broader definition that includes second-generation and longer settled communities, a figure of 45 million was cited from another source. Notably missing also from the Statista graphic is any mention of India, who in 2019 were recorded by the UN as having the world's largest citizen diaspora at 17.5 million, a figure that would have been about 15 million in the year that the Statista graphic says that it looked at in the OECD data. This would make India's population of people living abroad almost 3 times the entire island of Ireland's population. Similar enough to the numbers in the aforementioned graphic, an OECD piece reported in 2009 that approximately 13% of native-born Mexicans lived abroad, equivalent to about 8.3 million people. Another more recent look at the numbers by the Mexican government, though, put that number at almost 12 million, which, if we continue with the kinds of comparisons we've been using, is not far off twice the entire population of the island of Ireland. For Ireland, the originally mentioned Statista piece cited that 770,000 native-born Irish are living abroad, about the same as 2/3 of the population of Dublin. Interestingly, in 2017, a publication by Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs estimated that there were approximately 1.5 million Irish citizens resident outside of the island of Ireland, although it noted that it didn't really have an official way of measuring things. If we are as generous as possible and take the definition of the Irish abroad to mean anyone of Irish ancestry, then we can hit a much bigger figure. For instance, census data from the USA alone shows that about 33 million people in that country identify as having Irish ancestry, with another 3 or 4 million saying they have Scotch-Irish ancestry. As this is only based on people's self-identification and not a detailed analysis of their heritage, this is likely a massive underestimate though, particularly when we bear in mind how many people in the US are of heavily mixed European ancestry. With this pretty sizable caveat in mind, Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs estimates the number of people worldwide with Irish ancestry at roughly 70 million, which would make it about equivalent to the size of China's 7th most populous province, or about 5% of the overall population of China. Or for a different comparison, 70 million is a bit more than 1/3 of the population of Nigeria, or 6.5% of the overall population of sub-Saharan Africa. So, although it's clear that seeing information like that presented in the original infographic can reveal interesting and important things about different places, unless we look at the real numbers, it's difficult to understand the true global context. It's clear also that differing definitions and methods of data collection from different countries makes getting accurate estimates of numbers difficult, and comparisons of countries even more difficult. We should be careful, therefore, to not just take such information without being critical. Going back to the numbers of native-born citizens abroad, next to countries like Mexico and China, Ireland's numbers of 770,000 are not particularly big. But in the context of Ireland itself, this number is quite staggering, and the social effects of having that many people living abroad is hard to understate, particularly when one notes that a significant number of those people are nowadays highly educated and working in critical fields such as medicine. In my last video on the economics of migration, I pointed out the large amount of natively trained doctors and nurses who withdraw from practicing medicine in Ireland in order to go and practice it abroad. Some of the major motivations for doctors and nurses to leave Ireland are the poor pay and working conditions they receive in Ireland compared to what they can expect in other developed countries. At the same time as this, Ireland has the highest reliance on foreign medical professionals of any European OECD country, with many of those incoming professionals arriving from comparatively poorer parts of the world, such as Pakistan and the continent of Africa, where lower pay and worse working conditions are more commonplace. While strikes in 2019 have led to an improved pay deal for nurses in particular, many nurses still consider emigration an attractive option due to the fact that working conditions in Ireland are still so poor. Arguably, the Irish healthcare system's reliance on foreign workers is used more than just to plug gaps left by leaving native workers, but is actually used to perpetuate the conditions that both Irish workers and the broader public want changed. As long as the system can replace disgruntled native workers with cheaper labour from overseas, then it has no reason to listen to their demands. And as long as those who are disaffected are leaving the country in large numbers, the less any government need consider them a challenge to their power electorally. As cynical as this may sound, this kind of thinking has precedence in the Irish political system. As I've mentioned already, Ireland has had a long history of emigration. Prior to the 20th century, this emigration is typically blamed on enforced economic hardship and neglect of the country by the British state that ruled over it, which reached its peak in the famine years, when roughly 1 million people died and another 1 million emigrated. Less often talked about, though, are the almost as incredible numbers of people who emigrated from Ireland after the country partitioned and the southern portion gained independence. Since the 1920s, roughly 1.5 million people have left the Republic of Ireland and continue leaving to this day. Throughout this time, the mismanagement of the country could no longer really be blamed on the British, but instead was the fault of the Irish social and political elite, whose interests were embodied by the two political parties that have dominated the country in the last century, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Despite both parties regularly donning the dressings of nationalism inherited from their revolutionary precursors, post-independence Ireland's political elites have arguably cared less for the common Irish people and more for the interests of the country's wealthiest social strata. Within this context, emigration long served the function of a social and political safety valve. When unemployment became too high, demand for jobs could be decreased by having unemployment agencies advertise work in Britain or elsewhere. When public dissatisfaction might threaten to unseat the political class, the votes and the voices of the people that weren't being catered for could be pushed overseas, where they would no longer be able to influence things at home. In the words of historian Enda Delaney, writing in the Irish Times in 2015 about the so-called forgotten Irish, no politician speaks much about this group. Why? They don't vote in Irish elections, though little talks about when it comes to their welfare or place in modern Irish identity. Ireland's immigrants have now become a sort of rhetorical tool for those who wish to snarkily shut down discussion of population movement or changing demographics in Ireland itself. In essence, the argument goes like this: the Irish have gone over to other people's countries in large numbers. Therefore, Irish people have no right to complain about any amount of people coming to their country. Besides the ignorance that this implies about the experience of Irish immigrants, i.e. that they often actually left only reluctantly, and only as a result of the actions of the same political class that now enthusiastically promotes inflows of people from other parts of the world, and were often left with a profound sense of dislocation that they never adapted to. This argument rests mainly on the idea that migration is a moral discussion. The global movement of people is both transcendentally good in itself and something that should be imposed on countries like Ireland by way of repayment for the fact that their people moved all across the world. This kind of thinking has emerged in a particularly pointed way out of highly politicized sections of academia, humanities and liberal arts departments, along with the quasi-celebrity figures that belong to them and who are regularly given platform by the Irish media. Out of this milieu has come a determination that Irish identity be deconstructed, apparently as a necessary step toward a globalized, utopian future. In truth, this kind of thinking is an import from the academies of America and other Western countries, and the desire to essentially destroy older notions of Irishness is part of a broader push to dismantle the legacy of European colonialism, despite the obvious irony that the Irish were themselves a colonized people, whose global movement in recent centuries was less about conquest than forced movement by colonial powers and capital interests. Interestingly, framing this debate in these emotional and moral terms casts those who consider themselves left-leaning and in possession of the proper cosmopolitan points of view on the same side as the political and financial elite whose rule has time and again cast working-class Irish people out of the country of their birth. Much as with other woke cause célèbres, it seems to suit the ruling elite to adopt rhetorical flourishes about diversity, inclusivity, etc., whilst nakedly pushing for their own exclusive financial interests. Not surprisingly, in Ireland, these political interests can trace almost direct lineage back to the post-independence generations, who for decades tacitly encouraged widespread emigration before pivoting effortlessly to a global, financialized worldview that treated all people as interchangeable economic units. As I'm making this video, Ireland has just had quite an interesting general election, in which support for those legacy parties has fallen to an all-time low. Many people transferred their votes leftward, with Sinn Féin coming out as the biggest beneficiary of this. Whilst I'm under no illusions that any radical change will really result from it, it is interesting to note the level of public dissatisfaction that this election clearly records. It's interesting to note also that this was really the first time that right-leaning parties and individuals critical of inward migration and demographic patterns in the country stood in any notable numbers. With few exceptions, almost all of them did incredibly poorly. But regardless of their small showing, it's clear from both their emergence and the success of the left-wing parties, whose platform rode on widespread outrage over housing and healthcare, Ireland is entering a new era in which migration will inevitably influence the political discussion, even if often in subtle and unspoken ways. For as I've looked at before, it's often the communities that have had massive outflows of people in recent generations that are now being asked to accept inflows of outsiders, or to accept a diminishment of local resources relative to the fattening of the capital, Dublin, which becomes less and less an Irish city and more an undifferentiated, globalised zone all the time. Their outrage at a system that forces their sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, etc. to live far away from them, at the same time as it hands massive tax breaks to foreign megacorporations who pressure the government to bring in large amounts of cheap overseas labour, has finally made at least a small dent in the national discussion. The polarisation between the Ireland that has embraced cosmopolitan, global values and the Ireland that has been left behind is wider than ever.